Good evening, it's Right Blend. Let's talk about day 7 of Pat King in court here in Ottawa. Today, the Crown continued with their witness, Officer Jordan Blondy, Blonde, of the Ottawa Police Service, and at the time of the Freedom Convoy in January and February of 2022, he was a police liaison team officer partnered with Officer Nicole Botch. You might recall Officer Botch from the Litch Barber trial, and as well Officer Blondy as well. I think they both testified over there. Blondy definitely testified in the Litch Barber trial, and the defense brought up some of his testimony. But we'll get to that because today resumed with Blondy on the stand, and he was in chief examination with the Crown. The Crown was asking him, as you will recall from yesterday, about his observations on specific streets at specific times. So that was more or less the flavor of today's Crown Crown examination in chief of Officer Blondy, acting sergeant, I guess. I just call him Sergeant Blondy. And he testified about his observations. He testified about a parking lot at the corner of Queen and Kent Street that they were having an issue with. It seemed from his testimony that at one point the people in the parking lot at Queen and Kent were okay with the people staying there, the protesters, as long as they were off to one side of the parking lot. But then on one day they decided that it was no longer okay, so they actually asked Officer Blondy to attend as a PLT with, I think, other officers perhaps, to serve a trespass notice to the people in the parking lot some days after the parking lot had initially agreed that it was okay for them to be in one corner of it. So Officer Blondy spoke to that. He spoke to different things that he attended. Of course, he spoke to attending Confederation Park with the ice shack, or the 12 by 12 foot building that was erected, the Cook Hut. We talked about that a lot yesterday. He also talked about attending the baseball field, I believe on the 9th or the 10th of February. I don't know. There was a lot of information today. I'm a bit off. And how it went over there. And he talked about how, in general, he was not doing any enforcement as a PLT. It's contrary to PLT. But he did testify that if there was a serious assault or crime in progress, that he is a sworn police officer, so he would arrest the person, as is his duty and obligation to do so as a sworn police officer. But mainly he saw himself as an information conduit between any stakeholder, could be a protester, someone who doesn't like the protest, anybody, and his chain of command. So he was to give information to them and to receive information to them from them to the chain of command, and vice versa. So that was his main role, information gathering, and to ensure that the protest remained peaceful, lawful, and safe. And we'll talk about that because there were some pretty wild things said towards the end of the defense cross. Like, the end of the day was pure fireworks. I'll tell you more about it. I mean, not literally, but they did talk about fireworks too. Let me get my water handy because it's been a pretty dry day. I like how we can have the props. I like when we can use props to assist ourselves in that. But again, just a deluge of information talking about attending. Officer Blonde did testify that the Rideau Sussex corner was one that was contentious throughout the protest. The most contentious, I believe he even said to the defense. But he also testified that there were people in other places. This is bouncing the cross now, that there were people in other places at the protest who took off their wheels or removed their brake lines, who were doing things that were highly contentious and obstructionist is my word. That last one is my word, that they were being obstinate, obstructionist to police, and so forth. And Officer Blonde testified on cross that their objective was to, and their messaging was consistently letting people to know to leave, that they expected people to leave at different points of the protest. It didn't happen. And he would often focus a lot of his conversations on understanding what people's what was their concept of the end of the protest. What did the end of the protest look like to them? What was their exit plan? And what was the win? What did the win look like to them? And he testified that a lot of people, I believe this was also on cross, he heard from a lot of people that they wanted recognition from Justin Trudeau, that they wanted to hear from him, that they wanted him to engage with them in some way. So that was important. So the Crown continued, and they got different observations. I do believe they asked Officer Blonde today about garbage, and he said garbage had accumulated at different areas, and they asked him about waste. The Crown, and he said that originally there was no porta potties or the like, but they worked hard to get them, and they did get them. I actually do remember the porta potties, but I do remember them actually being removed. I remember them along Metcalfe, and they had the name of the different politicians on them. And defense talked more about the waste and stuff. So you know what? The morning with the Crown and the examination in chief is kind of fuzzy for me. If you want to go in and see what the Crown was talking to Officer Blonde about, then you could go to that, but the defense cross is really what's fresh on my mind. That began in the afternoon. And we did end with Officer Blonde. Today's Officer Blonde was dismissed, and we're moving on to new witnesses tomorrow. So that's good news. So what did the defense talk to Officer Blonde about? Well, they asked him questions. They asked him, for example, about the garbage. They asked, Miss Calvino, for Pat King, asked, when you say that you noticed accumulations of garbage, you noticed them because they were accumulated in one place. And I take that to mean that they were collected and put there for collection. And he said, yes, they were in one place. They were culminating in one place. And so that was an interesting point. I'm sorry, guys. There's a lot of stuff. Drawing a bit of a blank, but let's keep this. This one's probably going to end up being a little shorter, so you might enjoy that. Again, if you want more of the details, hop on over to my X account, RightBlend, and you could follow along with the day's proceeding, and you could see a pretty good picture of what happened. I'm trying to give you the synopsis, the whatever notes version, but it's difficult today. You know, some days are harder than others. It's really hot, and I'm sensitive to that. But so. Again, a lot of questions from Miss Calvino about Rideau, Sussex, and about other areas, and about this is something that was elicited on examination in chief concerning the messaging that PLT was doing on the 15th, the 16th, and the 17th of December, and it was talked about also on Cross. Basically, that the messaging was escalating. That the 15th, they had this very small pamphlet that they handed out to people. Maybe they didn't even hand it out very much. Maybe it was just a PLT script, meaning that it was a verbal communication that PLT was given, basically just bullet points of things to communicate to people that there could be escalating enforcement and different risks, and that they could, have fines and stuff. And then I believe on the 16th of February, PLT went and actually distributed physical flyers, and I believe those were what we refer to as the blue letter. It had the blue outline on it. The Ottawa Police letter had no signature or anything like that, and Officer Blonde admitted that it didn't have a signature, and that was a question that Ms. Calvino had, and we talked about that, how now instead of a tiny thing, it was a full-sized piece of paper. It was a bright blue color. The font had changed, maybe is a bit bigger now, and the language is different. That it's telling people about the consequences. If you don't leave, you could be subject to arrest. You might not get bail. There could be penalties for your company, for your truck, for your license, and so on. And then the red letter on February 17th, which again, this time now the outline is red, and instead of saying you could or whatever, this is what could happen, it's saying this is what will happen. We are going to arrest you. You will be charged with mischief, this, that, the other thing. And so there was a lot of talks about this escalating enforcement. I don't know, they used a specific word that I can't bring to mind right now. Certainly they didn't use the word use of force. It was a different term. I just can't bring it to mind. I'm sorry. But that there was an evolution and escalation of the messaging going out to protesters, demonstrators. Ms. Calvino also made note to point out that, so again, you might recall that in the examination in chief, Officer Blonde was asked about numbers on specific streets, vehicles on specific days, like 50 trucks on this street at this day. And Ms. Calvino on Cross pointed out that Officer Blonde did not decipher whether or not those trucks were participating in the convoy or the demonstration or a demonstration. They were vehicles that were present, that he observed them, and he admitted that that's the case. So he did not go out and individually identify. He said some tools that could be used to identify people participating in convoy were flags or signs or different letterings and stuff like that on trucks and cars associated with the protest, but he did not do that when he made the counts on the different streets on the different days, and that's really important. He didn't determine who was who. And that's also true when he attended the February 10th slow roll at the airport that he testified, I think, both during the examination in chief and during the cross. And he testified that they were going slow and so forward. But on Cross, when he was asked about it, he said that he did not observe anyone cutting anyone off or anyone suffering injuries or damage, and that because he was asked if they were following road rules, and he said, well, I don't know about that, but he did observe them physically. So he did see them driving slowly, but he didn't see them cutting people off or causing injuries and so forward. And again, he was asked, did you determine who was or was not a protester? You could see traffic moving slowly, but did you determine how many was who? How many were protesters? How many were just traffic? And he did not make that determination. So that's also important, because it goes to show that he didn't make a note of who is actually participating, who's just in traffic, and so on. So this is important. This is a thread that is, as someone put, being pulled, because Without that exact information, it cannot be concretely said who is doing what, all right? Except for in the instances you have evidence otherwise. So this is important. It's important. The who, what, where, when, and why, and how. And this was the theme of the cross-examination. You'll find. So again, if you want more details, go and find them on my X. You'll see them there at RightBlend on X, and you can go through the whole day. Again, my fingers, I'm writing on a really tiny keyboard and I have really big hands and not the best typing strategy in the world, and I'm all crunched up. So a lot of excuses for why it's not verbatim, it's not great, it's paraphrasing, but you get a picture of what's going on. And that should be good enough. I think it will be. Thank goodness. So the cross-examination, Officer Blonde continues. We get to talking about the streets, talking about the February 14th. Remember the moving day? Officer Blonde calls February 14th the moving day because there was a plan that at some point, maybe February 12th or 13th, he became aware of, Officer Jordan Blondie became aware of, where there was going to be moving of trucks out of residential zones and onto either Wellington, closer to Parliament, to consolidate them, or onto the SJAM, the former Sir John A. Macdonald Parkway, which has been renamed. I'll just call it the Parkway, that extends from Booth westward, I believe, at that point. So what happened was, it didn't happen. There was some trucks moved, and then for some reason on the 15th, all of a sudden, for reasons beyond his pay grade, Officer Blonde testified he doesn't know the reasons, but it was just said, no, we're not doing it anymore. And he doesn't know who made that decision. It wasn't him who made that decision. Same with the closing roads. He doesn't know who made the decision, but that he did it, that it was made. It's above his pay grade. And when he was asked what's behind a closed road, he would testify, well, sometimes it was protest vehicles, sometimes it was a police vehicle, sometimes it was an open roadway. And also in his observations of, remember the counts of vehicles on certain roads at certain days, he also testified to lanes that were open. He testified to, at one point, he attended Kent, and that an emergency lane on Kent was opened. And I believe he testified he attended that with Chris Barber, and they were able to do that. He was not the primary contact for Chris Barber, but his partner, Officer Nicole Botch, was the primary contact. So some days she was off, she was in court, so he did get to liaise a little bit with Christopher Barber. And on one particular occasion, in the communication on moving day, I believe it was, and the defense explored this quite a bit on cross, that there was communication from Chris Barber that they were ready to move 13 trucks at an area, I think around Albert somewhere, but there was a police vehicle blocking it, and they needed it moved. And Officer Blondie was messaging him, and this is in evidence, that he's working feverishly on getting it moved, and at some point it did get moved. So this is an example of how some of the blockades, the police vehicles, either Jersey barriers, maybe city works vehicles like snowplows, graders, whatever, were creating an issue where people who wanted to leave might have had difficulty. And that was an example of that on the day where they were doing the city brokered deal to move trucks, that they were having issues because police vehicles were blocking the way. And this is something that the defense has made a note of, that if somebody wanted to leave, sometimes they couldn't because there was a Jersey barrier in the way, and that would require extra steps. And Officer Blondie always maintained that if somebody wanted to leave, it would be arranged. And he testified about times where people did leave, or he thought he did, or he said he was called to attend an area. I believe he testified today about attending an area where he was requested to come and help somebody move, but by the time he got there, they had already left. So, but there certainly was an added layer of complication with the police blocking, with the trucks blocking, with the city vehicles blocking, with the concrete barriers blocking, and other things. And this is something that the Crown and the witnesses have been very not wanting to. They'll admit it, that Jersey barriers require extra steps, but they won't admit that it's causing problems in the blocking of roads. So this is something that I believe the judge, it's common sense. You're going to put concrete barriers on roads, you're going to create issues for people trying to get around them. And then the defense also made note that at a certain point, maybe after February 15th, people who wanted to leave were able to leave, but if they had a vehicle or a truck, they were not allowed to leave with their vehicle or truck. They had to leave their truck there and then leave. So it became difficult to leave with your truck. There was discussion about the red zone, about people not being able to go in, and about from as early as January, a city news release where it said that if people, to avoid certain areas downtown where basically the area that extended to become the red zone. They list off all the borders of different things, but I believe in chief or re-examination, Officer Blondie testified that the red zone came to creation sometime after the Emergencies Act was invoked. But certainly there was messaging from the city before then to stay out of the area, and for people to just avoid it. They were painting it like this chaotic scene, and they didn't want people there. But again, a lot of good points made by the defense today. And then we get to the wild stuff. So let's get to there real quick because I want to keep this a bit shorter. So towards the end of cross-examination, defense is asking Officer Jordan Blondie about, he's an officer, if he sees something, he'll arrest it. And he says, you know, one of your goals throughout convoy was to create, to make sure that it's remained peaceful, lawful, and safe. And he said, it would say that, you would say you did that. And before he could answer, the Crown objected and said it's not for the defense to say whether it was lawful. That's a decision for the court to make. So what, is the Freedom Convoy on trial here? This is my comment. Is the Freedom Convoy on trial here, or is it Pat King? The court is going to decide whether the convoy protest was legal or not. I remember when the Crown opening statement, they said that the convoy was a mischief from day one, which is ridiculous, honestly. From the first day, it was a mischief, even though we've seen in evidence in Cross and this trial and other trials that it was the police who showed the different convoys arriving to Ottawa to protest. If you're coming down the westbound side of 417, take this exit, go up Kent, and then turn right on Wellington, and you could park 40 tractor trailers in the curb lane on Wellington. Leave these emergency routes open. The cops were telling people, here, go here and park here. And this is something that was brought to Officer Blonde, and he admitted that it was emails in the PLT team and that he would have been somewhat aware of them in some capacity, perhaps at some point. But certainly these maps were going around from police that were distributed to truckers, showing them, if you're coming from the eastbound side, Eastern Canada, you're coming up the 174, take this road and then go George ATN Parkway. It has this capacity, and here's the weight limits, and so on and so forth. So the police were showing everyone where to go. So the Crown is of the position that the convoy was a mischief from day one, even though the police themselves provided parking and staging instructions to the protesters on day one instead of just blocking them off, because according to the Crown, it's a mischief from day one. So shouldn't have the police just closed the access and said, no, this is an unlawful gathering, you can't come in? They didn't do that. So the Crown's position is untenable. And I think we'll see how that plays out. But nonetheless has nothing to do with Pat King. Of course, Officer Blondie testified that he never had any connections with Pat King at all. Never called him, never emailed him. He's not a social media guy, so he never followed him on social media. And he knew nothing about Pat King other than what he heard on the news. So that's it. So tomorrow, so let's get to the craziness. So at the end of the testimony, after the Crown does that objection, we're continuing cross. Blondie elaborates and says, no, actually there was a lot of law breaking throughout the entire convoy. There was people drinking open liquor. There was fireworks. There was constant honking of horns. And so he's asked, the defense asks him, okay, so was anyone ticketed? No, they weren't. Why? I don't know, above my pay grade. Then she asks, then Miss Calvino asks him, all right, so you're saying, there's all this craziness going on, but you're an officer, and if you see something serious, you can arrest, but you never did enforcement. And he testified, well, no, PLT is tenant. We don't do enforcement. That's just not what we do. But you're an officer, so you can arrest. Yes. Okay. So he never did. So that's in other words of saying that he never saw anything so dramatically violent that he had to intervene. And we also heard other things, like how on the 18th he wasn't engaged, and starting on the 18th he wasn't in the police line, but he was behind it, and he was trying to call his contacts on the phone, presumably trying to get them to surrender or whatever. And he talked about how he had different contacts who claimed to be in charge of different areas, and never even mentioned Pat King, like a Mr. V, who was in charge of some trucks in front of Wellington, so he claimed, and never associated with Pat King. So just, this is the defense's way of trying to say that Pat King wasn't in command and control here. And then, but Jordan Blondie was, led back to, in himself, he always brought it back to, no, there might have been different groups, but I referred to everything happened downtown as the Freedom Convoy. It wasn't different areas, as the defense was trying to say, okay, the Rideau Sussex people are one people, and Jordan Blondie would say, they're more contentious, but no, I understood everything in Ottawa and downtown from January to February 2022 was all Freedom Convoy. And so the defense would bring him to, okay, well, what about Confederation Park? They were their own group. And then Jordan Blondie would respond, no, actually, I also understood them to be part of it. And then he went on and describe the people in other areas of downtown who did other things, like take off their wheels and whatever. So there's a back and forth here. There's a push and shove. But going back to Officer Blondie and the violent reaction, something brought him to say that in regards to violence, he saw officers being swarmed. Well, he was asked first if he ever saw a bylaw officer. He said not that he could recall. And then he's asked if, about something, and then he says, well, officers were being swarmed. So then Miss Calvino was like, where? And so he had some trouble, and he said, World Exchange Plaza. So Miss Calvino says, when? He doesn't know when. Ms. Calvino says, you didn't take any notes of this. Nope. You didn't write this in the signal chats. Nope. You didn't call 911 or for assistance. Nope. And he said it was a common occurrence during the Freedom Convoy for officers to be swarmed. There's no notes of this, of course. I don't know how that's going to land with the judge. You know, you're talking about a major incident that's commonplace. You're not taking official duty notes. You're not putting this into PLT logs. You're not calling on the radio for people. It's a hard sell. And the defense, I think, Ms. Calvino handled that expertly in the way that once that was elicited from the witness, the way that she followed up, the questions she asked, just there's no credibility left on that line of questioning, and maybe the credibility everywhere else comes into question too. When at the end, after everything, you say, oh, you didn't even say it when the Crown was talking to you, but now on defense cross-examination. Sorry, I had a phone call, but this raises a lot of questions. You have this witness who didn't mention any of this swarming or anything during the Crown examination in chief, and now suddenly on defense cross-examination, they mentioned that officers getting swarmed are commonplace, but they have no notes, never called for anybody, et cetera, et cetera. I do believe earlier in the day, Officer Blondie testified that he asked after about an incident at Rideau, Sussex, might have been the 15th, when they were doing messaging. They had some people come up and swear and yell at them, and then the next day when they went to, I believe it was Coventry Baseball Field, the 16th or whenever it was that they went, they had a quick reaction team come with them who were police officers just for security reasons. But Blondie then testified, you know, in cross-examination towards the end that no, it's commonplace that we were getting swarmed. Didn't make other notes of it besides that one event. Didn't go back to that one event that he mentioned earlier. Just said it was common. Didn't take any duty notes. No PLT logs, no calls for backups, no radio chatter, no 911 calls, no calls to supervisors, nothing traceable, no observations of who these people were, what they were a part of. Who knows? They might not have been even convoy protesters. They probably weren't. So it's hard to say, right? It's just really hard to say. There's no evidence. There's no evidence. So on Crown re-examination, the last Crown question that they had for the witness, and as my understanding is, you can't ask something that hasn't been elicited from the defense. So I don't know how this stood, and I don't really understand how this gets in, but the Crown asks Officer Blondie, can a truck be made into a weapon? And then Officer Blondie testifies, yes. And I'm just sitting there with my jaw on the floor. The defense didn't object. The judge didn't say, well, this is ridiculous. It was such a comment so far out of field that I was shocked. I was probably the most shocked I've ever been in one of these court proceedings, the way that was brought in. That can a vehicle, a truck be made into a weapon? Yes. What does that have to do with anything that happened at Freedom Convoy? Did anyone take their truck and use it? No, I don't believe it did. There might have been one incident with a truck allegedly hitting a police car or something, but certainly nobody weaponized their vehicle to go run down crowds. It didn't happen. It's just mind-boggling, and certainly that incident that may have happened with the truck and the police car wasn't brought into the evidence by any party. So it's just mind-blowing. So we did finish with Officer Jordan Blondie, and now we moved on to some housekeeping, which we expect now the Crown to finish their case tomorrow. They're going to bring in the officer who arrested Pat King, and they're going to bring back Natalie Hanaud from OC Transpo to finish up that, and then they expect their case to be ended. And then we're going to hear from the defense's first witness, who is expected to be former RCMP officer Daniel Bulford. So I look forward to that, and maybe another defense witness tomorrow. We're not sure yet. And then there's going to be a break. The defense and the other parties may be working on getting some more dates around the June 17th time so that they can finish the evidence portion of the trial and leave the last week in July just for submissions. So in any case, and also someone informed me that a decision in a judge alone trial is not called a verdict. It is called a judgment when they find you guilty or not guilty. So thank you. You know who you are. From Ottawa, I'm Right Blend. Thanks for listening.